The hospitality tent at Dodger Stadium was doing what hospitality tents do on November 20th, 2022. Champagne flowed under string lights, while Elton John's final notes drifted across the Los Angeles night sky. Disney's executive leadership had gathered for what was supposed to be a celebration, the kind of corporate event where deals get whispered over appetizers and everyone pretends the stock price isn't cratering. Then the phones started lighting up. One screen, then another, then a cascade of blue light pulling executives into shadows, hands cupped over devices, voices dropping to urgent whispers. Bob Chapek watched the fracture spread through the crowd, his own phone buzzing for the third time in 6 minutes. The board chair. Again. He silenced it because the live stream was still running, and you don't take crisis calls at company events, not when cameras might be watching. But the executives around him had stopped pretending to watch the concert. They were staring at screens, reading something that had just detonated their Sunday evening. Across the parking lot, inside a blacked-out Escalade with tinted windows, Bob Iger was already reading the press release. 17 minutes until it hit the wire. The board had moved faster than he'd anticipated. Sunday night, middle of a concert, no warning to the man whose job he was about to reclaim. He watched the tent through the glass, trying to pinpoint the exact moment when Bob Chapek would realize that his 3-year war wasn't ending in stalemate. It was ending in obliteration. By the time the applause died and the crowd began to disperse, the man who had run the Walt Disney Company since February 2020 was standing alone near the catering table. He was staring at his phone like it had just delivered a terminal diagnosis. The press release that announced his termination didn't include a single quote from him. Not one word. What forces a board to fire a CEO on a Sunday night without even letting him defend himself? To understand how Disney's succession became a corporate execution, you have to go back to February 25th, 2020, when Bob Iger stood in front of microphones and announced his retirement, effective immediately. 15 years as CEO, the architect of Pixar, Marvel, Lucasfilm, and the massive Fox acquisition that reshaped Hollywood's power structure. Under his leadership, Disney's stock had climbed over 400%. He was the gold standard of legacy media executives, and now he was stepping down to hand the company to Bob Chapek, the parks chairman whose name surprised almost everyone in the industry. But here's what most people missed in the announcement. Bob Iger wasn't actually leaving. His succession plan allowed him to stay on as executive chairman for 22 more months. He would retain control of something called creative endeavors, nebulous phrasing that suggested he'd still run Disney's movie and television operations while Chapek handled day-to-day business. Any big creative decisions, Iger told CNBC on the day of the announcement, he fully intended for Bob Chapek to be at his side. The Disney board suggested that Chapek should move into Iger's expansive corner office at the company's Burbank headquarters. That's when things got strange. Bob Iger told them he wouldn't be moving out. He needed the space, he explained, because the office had something he couldn't give up: a private bathroom. With a shower and a shaving vanity, installed decades earlier when Michael Eisner ran the company. Iger told Bob Chapek that he lived for what he called 2 shower days, rinsing off after his 4:15 a.m. workout, then showering again before evening premieres and award shows. Since he'd be staying on as executive chairman, he'd need access to those amenities. Bob Chapek, still processing that he'd just been handed the top job at a $150 billion company, said he understood. He moved into a smaller office down the hall. If you walked into that smaller office in those first weeks, you'd find Bob Chapek sitting in a workspace without the executive shower, without the expansive square footage, and without the 2 framed posters that hung on the bathroom wall in Iger's office. One was a collage of newspaper headlines celebrating Disney's 2009 Marvel acquisition, arguably the shrewdest deal in modern entertainment history. The other was a parody movie poster, the Iger Sanction. Bob Iger's face photoshopped over Clint Eastwood's from the 1975 thriller. This wasn't about a shower. It was about a man who had pushed back his retirement 4 times and still wasn't ready to leave. But what nobody seemed to realize in February 2020 was that Disney had tried this exact succession structure once before, and it had ended in catastrophe. In 2004, Michael Eisner attempted to do exactly what Bob Iger was doing in 2020. Eisner wanted to step down as CEO while remaining as chairman of the board, keeping his hands on Disney's steering wheel even as someone else held the title. Disney's board of directors at the time wrote a formal statement opposing the plan. Any arrangement that permits Mr. Eisner to remain as chairman after relinquishing his position as CEO, they wrote, is contrary to best governance practices. When shareholders voted on Eisner's re-election to the board in 2003, 43% withheld their votes. It was a humiliating rebuke. Eisner gave up his chairman role in March 2004. He resigned as CEO entirely by September 2005. Bob Iger assumed leadership of Disney without anyone hovering over his shoulder. That freedom allowed him to move quickly on decisions that Michael Eisner might have blocked, like the $7.4 billion Pixar acquisition that saved Disney's animation future. Iger describes the acquisition process at length in his autobiography, writing about how critical it was to have clear authority to act. In 2020, he created a succession structure nearly identical to the one that had destroyed his predecessor's exit. The difference, people close to the situation said, was that Iger believed Bob Chapek would be different. He'd be compliant, operational, focused on spreadsheets and park attendance rather than Hollywood ego battles. One source described Chapek to CNBC as a tuna salad sandwich who sits in front of spreadsheets. Iger had passed over 2 other executives in the succession process, Kevin Mayer, who had architected the Disney Plus launch, and Peter Rice, who ran television entertainment. The board felt both men had leadership styles that were too brash. Mayer had never run a business of real scale. Rice had only joined from the Fox merger less than 2 years earlier. But here's what nobody asked. Bob Iger never consulted anyone who worked directly for Bob Chapek before naming him CEO. He had pegged Chapek as someone who would accept his unusual succession plan. What Iger didn't anticipate was that 3 days into Chapek's tenure, COVID-19 would shut down every Disney theme park on Earth. In March 2020, on a flight to Disney's annual shareholder meeting in Raleigh, North Carolina, Iger caught Chapek off guard. He told the new CEO, who had only attended the meeting once before as a guest, that he'd be leading the question and answer section. Chapek retreated to study background materials in a private section of the plane. Iger expected they'd prep together. When Chapek studied alone, Iger took offense. He later described the moment to colleagues as his first sign that his replacement wasn't the collaborative CEO he'd been hoping for. On the flight back from Raleigh, as the pandemic exploded across the country and theme parks began shutting down, Bob Chapek held his first CFO meeting with Christine McCarthy. Iger was sitting nearby. He snapped at them, calling it disrespectful to hold the meeting in front of him. Chapek would later speak about this moment to friends as the first sign that Bob Iger regretted stepping down. By June 2020, the board of directors held an executive session via Zoom. They asked Bob Iger to stay on the call. They did not ask Bob Chapek. According to people familiar with the conversation, Iger told the board that his relationship with Chapek had soured and that Chapek wasn't exhibiting proper leadership qualities. The pandemic was shaking Disney to its foundations, and Iger believed Chapek should be working more closely with the man who had run the company for 15 years. After Iger left the call, the board brought Chapek back and asked him if Disney employees were aware of how bad things had gotten between the two men. Chapek said he didn't think so, but he knew Bob Iger had been complaining about him to Disney confidants, to Hollywood executives, to agents. Bob Iger and Bob Chapek never participated in face-to-face mediation about their working relationship. The board knew they were at war, so why didn't anyone stop it? Bob Chapek decided to consolidate power. In 2020 and 2021, he reorganized Disney's entire corporate structure, creating a new division called Media and Entertainment Distribution, under an executive named Kareem Daniel. The reorganization centralized profit and loss control for all film and television projects, stripping that power away from division heads. It was a complete reversal of Bob Iger's decentralized model, where each division operated with significant autonomy. The change detonated morale across the company. ESPN chairman Jimmy Pitaro became so demoralized that he contemplated leaving Disney entirely. Virtual meetings during the pandemic ballooned in size and became unwieldy. Junior executives from Daniel's distribution team were suddenly involved in negotiations because ESPN Plus was now bundled with Hulu and Disney Plus. They'd ask questions of league officials that exposed their lack of business knowledge. Conversations that used to be handled by experienced ESPN executives were now being run by people who didn't understand the sports media landscape. Throughout all of this, executives who had lost power under the new structure were frantically complaining to Bob Iger. And Iger told them he didn't agree with the reorganization. He told them there was little he could do. Except Bob Iger was doing something. According to reporting from the Wall Street Journal, he was holding strategy meetings with underlings without Bob Chapek's knowledge. Chapek began to understand that Iger's attitude toward Disney's workforce was simple. They work for me, not for you. Susan Arnold, who had taken over as board chair when Iger stepped down as executive chairman, had a strongly worded private conversation with Iger. People familiar with the exchange said Arnold told him he needed to focus on setting Chapek up for success rather than undermining him. But the shadow leadership continued. Then came the Scarlett Johansson disaster. During the pandemic, Disney released Black Widow simultaneously in theaters and on Disney Plus as a premium rental. The decision triggered a lawsuit from Johansson over compensation, and the legal battle became very public. What made it worse was that the lawsuit happened because neither Bob Iger nor Bob Chapek had clarified who should handle negotiations with Johansson's agent. Chapek viewed it as a creative issue and therefore Iger's problem to solve. Iger viewed it as a business matter that Chapek should handle. Both of them signed off on an aggressive public statement from Disney that accused Johansson of showing callous disregard for the pandemic's effects. Both of them later told people they regretted the tone of that statement. The lawsuit eventually settled out of court, but the damage to Disney's reputation with talent was done. Hollywood noticed that the company had allowed a dispute with one of its biggest stars to spiral into a public relations catastrophe. In November 2021, Bob Iger hosted a retirement party at his home in Brentwood. He reluctantly invited Bob Chapek. Chapek had a speaking engagement scheduled in Orlando that night, but he canceled it because of the optics. How would it look if Disney's CEO skipped his predecessor's farewell? Chapek showed up at the party, and Bob Iger gave a speech thanking dozens of people by name. He talked about executives who had shaped his tenure, about creative partners, about board members. he didn't mention Bob Chapek once. Chapek had reorganized the entire company. He had survived a revolt from creative talent. He had endured public humiliation at his predecessor's retirement party. But the real catastrophe was about to arrive from Florida. In early 2022, Florida's legislature began advancing what critics called the Don't Say Gay bill. The legislation would ban classroom discussion of sexual orientation and gender identity in primary schools. On February 24th, Bob Iger, now officially retired from Disney but still commanding attention across Hollywood, tweeted his opposition. "If passed," he wrote, "this bill will put vulnerable young LGBTQ people in jeopardy." During Iger's tenure as CEO, he had freely spoken about climate change, diversity, abortion rights. After George Floyd's killing, he had told Disney employees in virtual meetings that making their voices heard was the best way to bring about change. Bob Chapek, by contrast, stayed silent. On March 7, 2022, Chapek sent an internal memo to Disney employees. The company would not issue a public statement condemning the Florida bill, he wrote, because corporate statements do very little to change outcomes or minds. He cited Disney's $3 million in donations to LGBTQ organizations in 2021. He mentioned the company's long history supporting pride parades. The memo leaked online within hours. Disney employees revolted. They used hashtags like Don't Say Gay and Disney Do Better. Animators at Pixar sent a letter that became an unofficial manifesto of the internal dissent. "We at Pixar," the letter read, "have personally witnessed beautiful stories full of diverse characters come back from Disney corporate reviews shaved down to crumbs of what they once were. Nearly every moment of overtly gay affection is cut at Disney's behest, regardless of when there is protest from both the creative teams and executive leadership at Pixar." On March 9th, Bob Chapek reversed course during Disney's shareholder meeting. He publicly condemned the bill and announced that Disney would donate to the Human Rights Campaign. Within hours, the Human Rights Campaign rejected the donation, demanding a greater commitment to the LGBTQ agenda. On March 11th, Chapek sent another memo apologizing directly to employees. "You needed me to be a stronger ally," he wrote. "I let you down." On March 22nd, Disney employees walked out at the company's Burbank headquarters and at locations in Florida. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who had supported the bill, responded at an event in Boca Raton. "You have companies like Disney," DeSantis said, "that are going to criticize parents' rights. They're going to criticize the fact that we don't want transgenderism in kindergarten and first-grade classrooms. If that's the hill they're going to die on," he asked, "then how do they possibly explain lining their pockets with their relationship from the Communist Party of China?" Within weeks, the Florida legislature moved to dissolve the Reedy Creek Improvement District, the special tax district that had allowed Disney World to operate with autonomy since 1967. The political and legal consequences would stretch for years. But something else was happening behind the scenes that wouldn't become public for months. On July 15, 2022, while Bob Chapek was still reeling from the Florida disaster, Isaac Perlmutter called him. Perlmutter was the chairman of Marvel Entertainment and a major Disney shareholder. He was calling with a message. Activist investor Nelson Peltz wanted a seat on Disney's board. Perlmutter made the same call to Christine McCarthy, Disney's CFO. He called Safra Catz, who chaired the audit committee. He called the general counsel. The pitch was consistent. Adding Nelson Peltz to the board, Perlmutter said, would help Mr. Chapek counter recent headwinds he had faced. It would solidify his position as CEO. It would preempt any other potential shareholder nominations at the 2023 annual meeting. Then Perlmutter added something that would prove prophetic. He said that without Mr. Peltz on the board, former executives, including Mr. Iger, would be back at Disney. When Perlmutter made that call in July 2022, Nelson Peltz didn't even own Disney stock yet. Bob Iger was officially retired. Bob Chapek had a contract extension that ran through 2025. So how does a prophecy made in July turn into a Sunday night execution by November? Fall 2022. Christine McCarthy went off script. During a board preparation meeting weeks before the November earnings call, Disney's CFO warned that the company's quarterly results would fall catastrophically short of Wall Street expectations. The streaming business was hemorrhaging money, and analysts had fundamentally shifted how they evaluated companies like Disney after Netflix's stock collapsed earlier that year. The company needed to retool its strategy, McCarthy argued. Bob Chapek largely downplayed her predictions. In the weeks before the earnings call, Disney held an executive retreat at Walt Disney World. Bob Chapek spent most of his time participating in activities at Animal Kingdom rather than attending strategy sessions. Communications Officer Christina Shaky and Investor Relations Head Alexia Quadrani warned him directly. The market reaction to the earnings, they told him, could be devastating. Chapek called the three women, McCarthy, Shaky, and Quadrani, the mean girls. He dismissed anyone expressing trepidation about Disney's prospects as Eeyores. He ignored the financial team's advice to deliver a message during the earnings call that acknowledged the company's losses and outlined a clear path forward. November 8, 2022, the fourth quarter earnings call. Disney missed Wall Street expectations on both revenue and profit. Revenue came in at $20.15 billion. Analysts had expected $21.26 billion. Earnings per share were 30 cents. Analysts had expected 51 cents. The streaming business reported an operating loss of $1.47 billion in a single quarter. Since the launch of Disney+, the streaming division had lost more than $8 billion. Operating income was down $864 million. Christine McCarthy delivered the line that ended Bob Chapek's career. We currently expect total company fiscal 2023 revenue and segment operating income, she said, to both grow at a high single-digit percentage rate. Not the 25% growth that Wall Street had modeled. Not even the double-digit growth that seemed conservative 3 months earlier. Single-digit percentage growth. Some analysts had Disney's growth forecast as high as 34% for the coming year. McCarthy fielded most of the difficult questions from analysts, while Bob Chapek, the CEO, remained largely silent. When he did speak, his characterization of the quarter was optimistic. He talked about progress toward streaming profitability, about the strength of the parks business. It landed like a hallucination. 6 hours later, CNBC's Jim Cramer called for Bob Chapek's firing on live television. "There is just no doubt that he has to go," Cramer said. "He's gotta be fired. That's pretty cut and dry." He said Chapek had made the earnings call sound like a 4-star quarter when it was clearly a disaster. The word he used was delusional. Disney stock dropped 8% in after-hours trading. 12 hours after the earnings call, Nelson Peltz called Bob Chapek. Peltz informed him that Trian Fund Management had just acquired a position in Disney worth approximately $500 million. Trian planned to increase that position to as much as $1 billion. Peltz told Chapek that Trian intended to nominate a slate of director candidates at the 2023 annual shareholder meeting unless Disney agreed to add Peltz to the board immediately. On November 10th, Isaac Perlmutter called Christine McCarthy and other board members again, advocating for Nelson Peltz. On November 12th, Bob Chapek flew to Palm Beach, Florida to meet separately with Peltz and Perlmutter. But by then, the decision had already been made. Throughout October and November, Disney's board of directors had been holding numerous meetings. The official proxy filing would later describe these sessions as discussions about governance and leadership matters, including concerns that had been emerging about Mr. Chapek's leadership and strategic vision, and whether he should continue as CEO. Christine McCarthy, according to reporting from the Wall Street Journal, expressed a lack of confidence in Bob Chapek directly to the board of directors. She was Bob Iger's CFO. She had stayed on under Chapek, and now she was telling the board that the CEO couldn't right the ship. In early November, Chapek sent a memo to Disney executives outlining the need for what he called austerity measures, potential layoffs, cost reductions, the creation of a cost structure task force consisting of himself, McCarthy, and the general counsel. The memo blindsided a number of senior executives. Multiple sources described it as tone-deaf. The move didn't engender trust with the executive ranks or with rank-and-file employees who were already rattled by the stock collapse. November 20th, 2022, a Sunday night. Disney's top executives were filing into the Dodger Stadium hospitality tent for Elton John's final North American concert. The board made the call. Bob Chapek was terminated as CEO. Bob Iger would return immediately. The press release hit the wire while the concert was still streaming. It didn't include a single quote from Bob Chapek. The next day, Kareem Daniel, Chapek's hand-picked head of media and entertainment distribution, was terminated. Within weeks, Bob Iger announced he would dismantle the entire reorganization structure that Chapek had built. Bob Chapek received a severance package worth more than $20 million. Christine McCarthy, Christina Shockey, and Alexia Quadrani, the women Chapek had called mean girls, reportedly received pink sweaters from a colleague as an inside joke after his termination. McCarthy remained as CFO. Some in the industry speculated she could be CEO material herself. Isaac Perlmutter, who had spent months advocating for Nelson Peltz and warning that Bob Iger would return, was later terminated from his position at Marvel Entertainment. And Bob Iger, who had spent nearly 3 years quietly holding meetings with executives, complaining to board members, refusing to vacate his office, and watching his hand-picked successor struggle through a pandemic and a culture war and a streaming collapse, Bob Iger got exactly what multiple sources said he wanted all along: his company back. But could the man who created this succession disaster really be the one to solve it? Bob Iger's first major move as returning CEO was announcing a complete overhaul of Bob Chapek's corporate reorganization. He consolidated Disney into 3 divisions: Disney Entertainment, run by Dana Walden and Alan Bergman; ESPN, still under James Pitaro; and Parks, Experiences, and Products, still led by Josh D'Amaro. The media and entertainment distribution division that Chapek had created was dismantled entirely. Iger announced $5.5 billion in cost cuts. 7,000 jobs would be eliminated. The stock initially responded positively to Iger's return, climbing on hopes that the chaos had finally ended. But the chaos had not ended. In January 2023, Nelson Peltz launched a proxy fight for a seat on Disney's board. He cited succession failures and tens of billions in lost shareholder value. Trian's presentations hammered Disney for botching the transition from Iger to Chapek, for losses in the streaming business, for strategic missteps. In February, Peltz dropped the proxy campaign after Bob Iger announced his restructuring plan on an earnings call. "Now Disney plans to do everything we wanted them to do," Peltz said on CNBC. "The proxy fight is over." In July 2023, Disney extended Bob Iger's contract to December 31, 2026, 2 years longer than originally planned. The board emphasized that succession planning was the company's top priority. In November 2023, Nelson Peltz renewed his proxy fight. This time, he wasn't asking for one board seat. He was seeking multiple seats and nominating former Disney CFO Jay Rasulo to join him. Trian's thesis was blunt. Disney's board had failed at succession. The company's long-term performance remained disappointing. Bob Iger's contract kept getting extended, but there was no clear plan for what happened when he actually left. Disney fought back. The company spent an estimated $40 million defending against the proxy battle. Bob Iger and board members gave interviews. Disney released detailed presentations attacking Peltz's credibility and his lack of a coherent strategic plan. The company's largest shareholders, Vanguard and BlackRock, decided in the final days before the vote to back Disney's existing board. In April 2024, shareholders voted. Nelson Peltz lost to incumbent director Maria Elena Lagomasino by a 2-to-1 margin. Jay Rasulo lost by 5-to-1. 75% of retail investors backed Disney's board. The proxy battle was over. Disney had prevailed. But Nelson Peltz told CNBC after the vote that he'd be watching. "We pulled out a year ago February," he said. "A lot of promises were made. We hoped they were going to keep them. They didn't, so we came back. Now we've got a new set of promises, and I hope they keep them. But if they don't," he said, "you'll see me again." On February 3, 2026, Disney announced that Josh D'Amaro would become the company's next CEO. D'Amaro was the chairman of Disney Experiences, the division that included theme parks, resorts, cruise lines, and consumer products. He had been with Disney for 28 years. He was, notably, another parks executive, just like Bob Chapek. The announcement said D'Amaro would take over on March 18, 2026. Bob Iger would step down more than 2 years ahead of his contract expiration. He would serve as a senior advisor and remain on the board through the end of the year. James Gorman, the former Morgan Stanley CEO who had been brought in as Disney's board chairman specifically because of his track record with successful succession planning, called the process long, thorough, and exhaustive. The entire board had been engaged, Gorman said. They had worked closely with Bob Iger. They had external oversight. After mentoring and developing the next Disney successor, Iger had decided to step aside early. He wanted to work with D'Amaro and the executive team to ensure the company got off on the strongest possible foot for the next decade. Nelson Peltz had a different interpretation. In February 2026, he told the Wall Street Journal that Bob Iger had chosen D'Amaro, a parks executive rather than entertainment chief Dana Walden, because Iger needs a reason to stay on. Choosing someone from the parks division rather than a Hollywood veteran, Peltz argued, creates space for Iger to remain a guiding force in creative decisions even after he steps down from the CEO title. If you walk through Disney's Burbank headquarters today, you can find the corner office where this all began. The private bathroom is still there. The shower that Bob Iger refused to give up when he stepped down in February 2020. The shaving vanity installed for Michael Eisner decades ago. The 2 framed posters still hang on the wall. The collage of newspaper headlines celebrating the Marvel acquisition. The parody movie poster, The Iger Sanction, with Bob Iger's face over Clint Eastwood's. Bob Chapek spent 3 years in a smaller office down the hall. 3 years that he described to friends as hell, defined by one overriding theme: his unrelenting fear that Bob Iger wanted his job back. The board fired him on a Sunday night without including a single quote from him in the press release. He received a $20 million severance and disappeared from public view. The office where he worked for those 3 years is occupied by someone else now. Disney has announced its next CEO. Bob Iger says he's stepping down early to ensure a smooth transition. After 4 delayed retirements, after a hand-picked successor who lasted less than 3 years, after 2 proxy battles and a corporate civil war that cost billions in shareholder value, can Disney ever escape the shadow of the Bobs? The board says the succession process was exhaustive. James Gorman says they got it right this time. But the shower keeps running. The posters stay on the wall. And somewhere, Nelson Peltz is watching.